On this warm summer day, Charlotte and Albert Morgan woke up earlier than usual, and it wasn't the neighbor's dog Spike who woke them up with his incessant barking. The reason why the elderly couple got up so early was probably the fact that they were always in a very bad mood on that day. After all, that was the day on which 5 years earlier, their only daughter Diana died in a terrible plane crash. And despite it being so long ago, Charlotte Morgan still routinely blamed herself for everything that had happened. If I hadn't been so strict with Diana, perhaps this tragedy would have been avoided, she'd say, sifting through photographs of her late daughter. In response to his wife's words, Mr. Morgan nodded sympathetically and, like her, felt an intense guilt stirring in the depths of his soul. As a child, Diana had always been an intelligent and obedient girl who easily found common ground with their parents. But the older she got, the more her willful character became prevalent, and it was her wild nature that led the girl to do some crazy and very unpredictable thing. Diana's parents tried to influence their daughter in any way they could, but their efforts were always in vain. When Diana became an adult, she enrolled in college. 3 years later, though, she was expelled for missing too many classes and her poor performance. According to her teachers, Diana was too preoccupied with her new boyfriend, who had eventually led her astray. Of course, this news was very unpleasant for Diana's parents. They had long dreamed of their daughter's success in the field of economics or law. After dropping out of the university, Diana rented a house on the outskirts of town where she lived with her fiancé. That's when Mrs. Morgan had made that fatal mistake, which, in her opinion, led to her daughter's demise. Mrs. Morgan was outraged by her daughter's behavior and flatly refused to meet Diana's fiancé, who she considered to be a scoundrel and a nobody. This resulted in a rift that lasted nearly 4 years and ended in Diana's death in a plane crash. In the first hours of the accident, the Morgans still had hope that their daughter had survived by some miracle. But when the rescuers showed them Diana's personal belongings, their hope shattered before their very eyes. And then, as Mrs. Morgan looked down at the photograph of her now passed daughter, she realized that no personal ambition should have ever been cause for a fight with someone so near and dear. Why don't we invite some relatives over for tonight? Let's have a memorial dinner in Diana's honor. It has been 5 years after all, Mr. Morgan suggested cautiously. Mrs. Morgan only grimaced and shook her head in response. Mrs. Morgan wanted to be alone on this memorable day, left to her heartache and longing for her beloved daughter. She knew full well that their relatives would stay a while, leave, and she'd be tormented with guilt for a long time to come. Mrs. Morgan snapped out of her grief by the persistent ringing on the phone. Perplexed as to who it could be, she immediately picked up the phone. "Hello? Grandma? Is that you? I'm your grandson, Kevin," said a boyish voice on the other end of the line. "I'm sorry, what grandson? You must have the wrong number, dear," said Mrs. Morgan, trying not to get overly excited. "No, Grandma, no, it's Kevin. Mom left me your phone number. She died in a plane crash. I'm in an orphanage near the city park. We're actually not allowed to use the phone, but I called you anyway. It's very bad here. Grandma, please get me out of here." The boy whispered through tears and hung up. Needless to say, the unfamiliar boy's voice made quite an impression on Mrs. Morgan. Of course, Mrs. Morgan understood that young children make these kinds of mistakes, so the boy could have easily dialed the wrong number. But then, how could he have known that Diana died in a plane crash? She thought to herself. Not knowing what to do with this information, Mrs. Morgan decided to confide in her husband. "That's a very curious story. Maybe we should visit the orphanage and talk to the boy personally?" Mr. Morgan suggested. Mrs. Morgan smiled approvingly in response and told him that he had read her mind. Mrs. Morgan was excited to see what this boy, who claimed to be her grandson, even looked like. To her great surprise, the management of the orphanage did not greet her kindly. "Mrs. Morgan, don't get us wrong. We don't mind you seeing Kevin. But what makes you think he's your grandson? Sure, his mother died in a plane crash, just like your daughter. But Kevin has a completely different last name," said the director of the orphanage, with particular emphasis on the last name. Stephen Hall had been the orphanage director for the past 15 years and thought that he'd already seen everything. That's why Mrs. Morgan's words didn't move him, no matter how much she insisted that the 9-year-old orphan was her grandson. "Mr. Hall, please, allow me at least one meeting with Kevin. After all, he reached out to me directly, which means he must know something," Mrs. Morgan pleaded. The director couldn't go back on his word and decided to allow Mrs. Morgan to see the boy. When Kevin appeared in the large guest room, Mrs. Morgan went pale and almost fainted. The 9-year-old boy looked exactly like Mrs. Morgan's late daughter. The same sandy blonde messy hair and those blue eyes, full of unrestrained vital energy. "Hello, Grandma," the boy said with a smile. "Hi, Kevin. I'm very glad to see you. Tell me, please, how did you find me?" asked Mrs. Morgan carefully. Kevin looked for a moment at the older woman before sighing sadly and beginning his story. Kevin revealed that he remembered almost nothing of his past. When his mother died, Kevin was only 4 years old and didn't even know his first or last name. Kevin vaguely remembered being brought to the orphanage by an old lady. She left the boy's name, along with the phone number of his relatives. The orphanage staff dialed the numbers immediately, but no one answered the phone. Assuming that the old lady had deceived them, the orphanage caretakers followed protocol, entered the phone number into the boy's personal file, and left it on the shelf. It was only by some absurd coincidence that Kevin managed to discover the number. It's all starting to make sense now. 5 years ago, there was a big storm all over the Northwest. The phone lines must have been damaged by the fallen trees, Mrs. Morgan whispered, feeling that everything was starting to come together. The orphanage staff was probably too lazy to try calling her again, and cut Kevin off from his family for 5 whole years as a result. "Grandma, are you really going to take me home? Some of my friends have already been adopted, you know, but no one seems to want to take me," Kevin said, sobbing. "Of course I will, honey. You can be sure of that. I'll just go and find out what documents I'll need for that," answered Mrs. Morgan and ruffled the boy's hair. But when the old woman voiced her intention to the orphanage director, she was bitterly disappointed. "Mrs. Morgan, at this point, adopting the boy is out of the question. First of all, you still have no proof of kinship. And second, you and your husband aren't young anymore. What would Kevin do if something happened to you? If you find any evidence that you're Kevin's grandmother, you're welcome to adopt him. But in the meantime, I can't help you," answered Stephen Hall, perhaps a little sharper than he should have. Right then, it felt to Mrs. Morgan as if the temperature of the office had dropped a degree or two. Barely managing to contain her emotions, blotting out her eyes with the handkerchief, Mrs. Morgan replied in a dry, formal voice, "All right, Mr. Hall, I'll find you that proof of kinship." Mrs. Morgan understood that her unusual case could only be helped by genetic testing, which would confirm their kinship. Without further ado, Mrs. Morgan sent a request for a DNA test to the relevant authorities. Unfortunately, a month went by before the permission was granted. It took another month to analyze and compare the samples taken from Mrs. Morgan and her alleged grandson, Kevin. In the meantime, Mrs. Morgan didn't just sit idly by. She began investigating her daughter's past life much more intently. As it turned out, Diane Morgan had never been married, and her fiancé had left her right after her son was born. Mr. Morgan was terrified to think of what her daughter, a single mother, must have gone through. Lord, all this time, Diana never once asked for my help. I was such a proud fool, waiting for her to call me first and repent, the elderly woman thought bitterly. Mrs. Morgan even managed to find the address where her daughter lived with her newborn grandson 5 years ago. The woman who lived there told her that she was the one to bring Diana's 4-year-old boy to the orphanage. She had attempted to call Mrs. Morgan back then, but on that fateful day, a hurricane had cut off the phone services to the north side of the town. Only now, 5 years after the plane crash, did Mrs. Morgan finally understand everyone's motives. Mrs. Morgan realized that the past couldn't be changed, and she sincerely wanted to help Kevin. Mr. Morgan fully supported his wife, who was very happy about a grandson appearing in their lives. But when the DNA results came back, it turned out that Kevin wasn't actually their grandson. How is that even possible? I know Kevin is my own blood," Mrs. Morgan said, clutching the piece of paper. In response, her husband slammed his hand on the table and declared at the top of his voice, "I don't care what the DNA says. I'm ready to take custody of Kevin, no matter what." Mrs. Morgan's face lit up at her husband's words, and a ray of hope flickered in her eyes. During that time, she fell so in love with Kevin that she was even willing to accept the fact that he was not her kin. And so, the Morgans went to great lengths to gain custody of the boy. And when the time finally came to take Kevin from the orphanage, a formal apology letter arrived in the mail on behalf of the director of the Bureau of Genetic Research. As it turned out, on the day of the DNA test, the testing staff made a fatal mistake. Those responsible had been fired, and steps were taken to ensure that something like that never happened again. For Charlotte and Albert Morgan, this meant only one thing. It was very likely that Kevin was their own biological grandson. "I always knew you'd take me home," Kevin exclaimed, waving goodbye to the orphanage. As he held his grandparents' hands, the boy laughed happily and was beaming with joy. Kevin was now sure of the fact that his relatives would never abandon him. He knew he was going to be taken care of until the end of his days.